before they pass the motion if you do that.
Okay.
All right, yeah.
Show 6:30. I'll call to order the February 27th meeting of the Tarpon Springs Planning and Zoning Board. Real quickly, just in case anybody in the audience is out there for these items, item number 4, that's application 22-126 for rezoning of property on the south side of Dixie Highway is deferred and will be re-advertised. Also, item number 5, application 22-143, ordinance 2023-06, a rezoning of 45.8 acres between North Highland and Keystone Road, is also deferred to a date specific of March 20th, 23. So if you're here for those items, they're not going to happen. So you can cut out and enjoy watching TV or whatever you plan to do. With that, would Board Member Vesey lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance and the invocation, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, we're a little bit farther into the new year. Our work continues. And I just ask that we, as a board and as a community, continue to put best forth efforts to make good decisions. Amen.
All right, that brings us to item number 2, our purpose and mission. Thank you for attending the City of Tarpon Springs Planning and Zoning Board meeting this evening. The purpose of the board is to conduct public hearings on the items that come before us. The Planning and Zoning Board has reviewed the evidence in the agenda packet for each item on the agenda this evening, including the application materials and the staff report. The board will consider that evidence along with any new evidence or testimony provided at this public hearing. The board will consider all the information provided at this hearing in accordance with the quasi-judicial procedures by which we're bound. I'll ask the city attorney to explain these quasi-judicial procedures at the appropriate time. This board uses these procedures to judge whether the application meets the intent of the city's adopted comprehensive plan and future land use map, and whether the application conforms to the city's currently adopted land development code and zoning atlas. The board will render a decision on each item in the form of a recommendation to the Board of Commissioners, who will take the final action on the item. The general hearing procedure for each item called for by the chair is as follows: staff presentation, applicant presentation, affected party presentation, public input, staff and applicant rebuttal, and finally, board motion, discussion, and vote. Can we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Seaman,
Yes, here.
Mr. Kouskoudis, Mr. Vesey,
Here.
Ms. Francis,
Here.
Mr. Rockline,
Here. Here.
All right. That brings us to item 3 and 4 that, as I already stated, has been deferred to a future time. So then that brings us to application, or item number 5, application 22-141, ordinance 2023-05. It's a future land use map amendment for approximately 6.71 acres located at 44098 US Highway 19 North, from residential office retail land use category to the commercial general and preservation land use categories. Could the city attorney read the ordinance by title, please?
Ordinance 2023-05, an ordinance of the City of Tarpon Springs, Florida, amending the future land use map for 6.71 acres, more or less, of real property located at 44098 US Highway 19 North from land use designation ROR, Residential Office Retail, to land use designations CG, Commercial General, and P, Preservation, providing for findings and providing an effective date.
Thank you. Can we have a staff presentation, please?
Sure. Allie Keene, Senior Planner with Planning and Zoning. Again, this is a future land use amendment application under ordinance number 2023-05. It's for the property located at 44098 US Highway 19 North. The current land use on the property is ROR, Residential Office Retail, and they are proposing a future land use designation of CG, Commercial General, and P, Preservation. The current zoning of the property is HB, Highway Business, which is a commercial zoning district. The property, again, is 6.71 acres in size. There is approximately a 0.2 acre area in the southwest corner of the property that are wetlands, and that is the area that corresponds with the P, Preservation proposed land use category. The site itself is vacant. It was formerly operated as a commercial golf driving range. The applicants are here seeking a future land use map amendment to have more consistent correspondence between the current HB highway business zoning category and the future land use. The property is outlined here in yellow. It's a little difficult to see, but right here on the Pasco County line, which is right on the northern border of the property, it is off of US Highway 19 North. The properties to the north within Pasco County are currently commercial office and warehouse uses. Across the street of US 19 are some retail and industrial uses, which is Northern Tool and Equipment and Caliber Collision. Immediate to the south is the Brittany Park townhome development, and then to the west of the site is a pretty large area of wetlands. This is a look at the survey of the property. Again, it is a vacant property. However, there is an existing curb cut onto US 19 here. The area shaded here in green is the 0.2 acre of wetlands. And again, this is the area that will be in the P category. The remainder of the site would be within the proposed CG, Commercial General category. One of the most significant features on the property is there's an existing 100-foot wide Duke power line easement, which is the blue shaded area. It bisects the property in half, going east to west. The presence of that easement does provide some limitations for future development of the property. There are some requirements and limitations by Duke of what can and cannot be within the easement, and this is for high transmission lines potentially. This is a look at the current future land use map. All of the properties that are fronting US 19 that are north of the Anclote River fall within the ROR or ROG mixed use categories, with the exception of Caliber Collision, which is in the IG Industrial General category. That particular property went through a land use amendment at the time that that property was proposed for development. But again, with the exception of that property, all properties fronting US 19 are within the mixed use categories of ROR and ROG. The property to the west of the site is again in preservation because it's a large wetland area. And then looking outside of US 19, there are some residential urban land use. When looking on the north side of US 19, this area kind of in black is in Pasco County again, and it is an industrial land use category. The two areas in red are retail commercial categories, and this yellow area is a residential 9-dwelling unit land use category. This is looking at the Fort Pinellas countywide plan map. The property, again, here in the corner, outlined in yellow, is located within the retail and services R&S category. The proposed land use amendment is consistent with that category and would not require any sort of amendment to the countywide plan map if it is approved. This table is looking at the comparison between the current future land use of ROR and the proposed CG category of commercial general. The intent of the ROR category is to allow and encourage a range of complementary uses in close proximity to facilitate shorter vehicle trips and alternative transportation choices such as walking and cycling. One significant aspect of the ROR category and all mixed-use land use categories in the comp plan is that it requires a mixture of uses. So there has to be some sort of residential component and non-residential component developed on that site in the future when it's proposed to be developed. The applicant has indicated that the presence of the 100-foot wide utility easement provides some limitations to having residential on that property, as well as some inconsistencies between its current zoning and the land use designation, which I'll get into. The intent of the proposed CG category is to designate existing commercial areas, which may be either highway or commercial oriented, and include uses varying degree of intensity. The biggest difference probably between these two categories are really outlined here in red, and those are the uses. So just for some clarity, the land use categories provide generally what uses are allowed on a property. The zoning categories or designations get more specific, so what specific land uses could be allowed in those categories. But if you have a land use that's in your zoning that might be allowed, but the underlying land use category says you can't do it, you still can't do it because the comp plan will override that. So in the ROR category, really it allows for office use, residential, public education, institutional, and community gardens. So it's very limited in what general uses could be allowed in that category. When looking at the CG category, it's not set up with primary and secondary uses. It just has uses that are allowed with no limitation of acreage, and then uses that are limited to a certain acreage allowance. In this case, the CG category allows for personal services, office uses, retail, commercial, transient accommodations, wholesale distribution, storage and warehouse, commercial recreation, research development, and light manufacturing. With a 5-acre maximum size, it would allow for residential and institutional uses. The other thing to point out here on this screen is the maximum FAR. The current category allows for a maximum FAR, or floor area ratio, of 0.4. The CG category does allow a slightly higher FAR of 0.45, but it is important to note that the existing zoning of highway business is more restrictive, so it limits it back to the 0.40, so it is consistent with what is currently allowed. Lastly, looking at the zoning considerations, again, this property is currently zoned HB highway business, and again, this is where you get into more specific land uses that could potentially be allowed. In this case, you're generally allowed office, retail, personal services, community services, and warehouse uses. You're only allowed residential for multifamily residential in this category, and it does require a conditional use approval. So just to remember that the current land use category requires a residential component. If they were to develop under the current designation, they would still have to go through a conditional use process to have that residential component a part of the development. When looking at your review criteria, first we looked at consistency with the Florida statutes. This particular request does qualify as a small-scale development amendment based on the size of the property. It also does not require any sort of text changes and is not located within an area of critical concern, which is the Florida Keys. We also did review all of the existing elements of the city's comprehensive plan and their goals, objectives, and policies. I did outline in the staff report, as well as put the corresponding reference numbers here on the slide of applicable goals, objectives, and policies. But overall, staff did believe that the allowable uses, densities, and intensities of the requested category was consistent with what's permitted in the current zoning, as well as consistent with what's in the surrounding area. We also noted that the proposed CG category does eliminate the requirement to have residential as a part of the future development, which again is more consistent with the development pattern of the US 19 corridor in this area. Lastly was consistency with the countywide plan, and as I mentioned earlier, it does not require an amendment to that map. With that, staff does recommend approval of ordinance number 2023-05, which is a future land use map amendment from ROR residential office retail to CG commercial general and P preservation. Public notice was provided. We did not receive any written responses. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a few questions, and I want to apologize for being late. I was running staff today at Steinbrenner, so I look like I've been playing baseball, but, so I apologize. So in any event, it's not a zoning change, it's an expansion of the existing uses, correct?
Right, it's not a zoning change. This is changing the land use, which allows them to potentially take advantage of all the uses that are allowed.
And so by expanding the uses, are we looking at the uses that they're looking at expanding it to? Are they going to be permitted uses or conditional uses?
So well, it depends on the use. So what I highlighted here, let's go to that table. So really what you're potentially approving or recommending approval of tonight is, and I apologize, this is very small. Right now, these are the uses generally that are allowed: office, residential, education. This is what you would open up potentially allowing, which would extend it to personal service, office support uses, retail, commercial, transient accommodations, wholesale distribution, et cetera. If the zoning potentially allowed something that fell within these categories, if it was permitted, it'd be allowed permitted. If it was a use that was within those categories but it was conditional, it's still required to go through a conditional use approval.
Thank you.
Any other questions for staff?
I have a couple, but I'm still kind of putting them together so they make sense. I'll start with an easy one. Do we have any idea what the intended end use is?
Right now, this is just the future land use amendment, but I can defer the applicant to expand on that.
As I continue to form my more difficult questions. So it appears that we have a wetland to the west and then a residential townhomes to the south. Would that be right?
Yes, that's correct. Let me find this. Sorry.
And then, of course, you pointed out that big blue thing in the center there. It's so nice to see you tonight, Alan.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So why do you think this property was originally designated as an ROR instead of a CG initially?
So I don't know the history of this, but looking at the future land use map and how it's laid out, it really appears that potentially the original intent was for the area north of the Anclote to maybe be more mixed use in nature. As it developed over time and potentially what was already there at the time, it's been more so commercial oriented, some industrial uses. Brittany Park Townhomes is the residential development in that area, but I believe that the intent at the time that it was put into that category was the future vision for that area.
That's a great segue, thank you. So Brittany Park, which is fair to say exclusively residential, and then this northern piece, as it's designated right now, it appears that the intent of when it was laid out was that it was to be mixed use and that there was to be residential there. It seems natural. And I know you've answered it in the, I'm still working on trying to put my question together right, because I've seen your proposal is that, so does staff feel that the parcel wasn't zoned correctly at that time, or has the land use, just the actual use changed that it now needs to be CG?
So it's not that it's necessarily zoned incorrectly. The highway business zoning district is compatible and consistent with ROR, but it does limit it to more office development, residential development, whereas highway business typically has more of your intensive commercial uses. So it's not that it's inconsistent right now, but this specific property, while staff had a recommendation of approval, we do feel like there are some limitations to developing it with a residential component, based off that Duke Energy easement, and then access to US 19 being its only access. There's some potential limitations for residential development. So that's why for this particular case, we felt that maybe having something that wasn't required to have residential would be appropriate.
Okay. Another question. So what would be the most, as I read the proposed FLU CG, what would be the most intensive use that would be allowed if this were to be approved under CG? Now, I'm going to ask you to stretch just a little bit, meaning that what is the most intensive thing that could be placed on the property if we were to approve this?
All right, I'm going to pull my.
I have it. So,
And I have it, forgive me. The bottom part is light manufacturing assembly. Go ahead.
so what I have pulled up right now is section 25.12 of your land development code. That is what is allowed in the highway business district, and there is a list of 30 permitted uses. Adult entertainment uses, bowling alleys, business and professional offices, car wash, community assembly, commercial recreational facilities, construction equipment, sales and rental, eating establishments, fast food, sit-down and taverns, emergency service facilities, financial institutions, hotels and motels, light printing establishments, light utility service, other community services not specifically listed, personal service establishments, post offices, repair service establishments, retail food establishments, retail nurseries and garden supplies, retail sales equipment, schools of special education, self-service gasoline stations, service stations, shopping centers, theaters, indoor transportation terminals, vehicle repair, minor and major vehicle sales and rental. And then there's also a list of 21 conditional uses that range from all kinds of commercial services, veterinary clinics, warehouses, heavy utility services, landscape service, light manufacturing, mini warehouse, multifamily dwellings, overnight boarding, daycare center, construction services, construction material establishment, congregate care, communications towers, billiards, arcades, game rooms. So it sounds like some of that is not permitted under ROR, but it would be permitted under CG in this particular zoning category.
Right. So in looking back at this table here where it says ROR, again, the general land uses, it really limits it more to business, professional offices, and residential. And again, some public education facilities and institutional, but those are really what it's limited to. So it potentially opens up the property to have options for more retail development and the commercial uses that are listed. And then just for some clarity as well, so this is a site that has no development whatsoever. So if this goes through, the board would see a site plan at the time that they have one to propose. So you would see a site plan, and we would verify that it complies with all the development standards of the code, including any sort of required buffers between Brittany Park and the commercial development, and landscaping requirements, parking, all of that. So it would come back before the board for site plan review.
If I may continue.
Go ahead.
And thank you. And I'm glad you segued right into buffers. So we heard an incredibly long list there, and you can read. And I just want to interpret that right. So the list that is shown there and on ours is not comprehensive, that the list that she read is the actual comprehensive list.
So that list is what is the permitted and conditional uses in the highway business zoning district, which is the current zoning of the property.
Right.
The land use is, because land use amendment requests, that's what's listed here. The land use has usually a shorter list, more general uses, and then once you get to the zoning districts, it has higher variety, more specific call out.
So
potentially, yes, this is the overall list of what uses potentially could be allowed.
Excellent, perfect. Okay, that's exactly where I needed to be. Thank you so much. And so I'm going to view this purely from the viewpoint of those folks that live along Brittany Park right there. So based on what I heard, it is possible that they could have a materials distribution of rock, and they could have, and I'm sorry to pick on this right now, they could have an adult entertainment facility right up against their back door. Would that be reasonable to say that that could, not saying that it would, but it could be an approved use?
So it's on the list of permitted uses, but there are several requirements for adult entertainment uses. If proximity to potential schools, I think parks, other different limiting factors. So I don't know if it would qualify, but it is a permitted use.
But it is a permitted use.
Correct.
So we could have, because it's highway, commercial, general, that it could be from heavy trucks loading rocks to the other thing that I mentioned. Those would be, at least be in the
Potentially, yes.
universe of things that could be done.
Yes,
Right now, they could not be done.
correct.
End of my questions. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for staff? All right. The script that the staff gave me does not ask for an applicant presentation, but I'm supposed to ask for the applicant presentation at this
you
point,
are.
correct?
Yes.
Okay. I thought maybe I was losing my mind. All right. Would the applicant like to make a presentation? State your name and address.
Amy Huber, 745 Virginia Street, Dunedin, Florida. Good evening. I'm here on behalf of the applicant, Moses Tucker Partners. Ali's presentation was extremely thorough, and in the backup to the application, we have the report from our expert planner, Robert Pergolesi, who's here to make a brief presentation to you. The reason we're here is what Ali was explaining, is there's a basic inconsistency between the comprehensive plan and the zoning for the property. So the comp plan says we have to have residential. The existing zoning says you can only have residential through a conditional use application. And so the property as it sits today has, as you saw, a huge Duke Energy easement that runs through the middle of it. And so an attempt to create residential and/or mixed use on this property is extremely difficult under those circumstances. And so therefore, we believe consistent and compatible with the other uses along Highway 19, and especially in that area and where it abuts Pasco County and the uses there, that it's much more compatible to have this property have a consistent zoning and comp plan designation of commercial general versus requiring residential in this location. So we're here to answer any questions that you guys have. I'm going to let Robert speak for a few minutes from a zoning and planning standpoint of why we believe that this is the right fit for that property.
Good evening. My name's Robert Pergolesi. I'm a principal with Gulf Coast Consulting. I'm an AICP certified planner and a professional transportation planner. And as Amy and Ali stated, you know, the site's, the ROR land use requires residential. And based on the highly commercialized area that we're in, the fact that Brittany Park Townhomes is the only residential development that's directly on US 19, we don't believe this site can be conducive for residential development. The site's in a highly commercialized area on a major commercial corridor, that being US 19, through the city, the county, and Pasco County. In addition, the site's bifurcated by a 100-foot wide Duke Energy easement, or Duke Energy right-of-way, which we would need to get Duke's approval to do anything on this site regarding that right-of-way. As was stated by Ali and Amy, there's a compatibility problem with the residential development in that the ROR land use requires residential, and that creates an internal inconsistency between the zoning and the land use. As Ali stated, you know, to the north, we've got Pasco County along Lewis Avenue. That's got C2 zoning, and that's consistent with the city's HB zoning. Pasco County C2 zoning is like the city's HB zoning. To the south, we've got Brittany Park, which is the only residential land use fronting 19. Further south of that, we've got Furman Volvo and Furman Chevrolet. Those are in HB zoning. And then, as Ali stated, to the east, we've got Caliber Collision and Northern Tools with CPD zoning. From our perspective, because the ROR land use requires residential as part of the mixed-use proposal, and the fact that we've got the Duke Energy easement right in the middle of our property, and that we're on a highly commercialized corridor that's dominated by retail, commercial, and office uses, we don't believe that ROR is the proper land use category, and CG is a better, more consistent and compatible land use category with the HB zoning. Finally, from a transportation perspective, the change from the ROR to the CG with the preservation actually looks like a reduction in traffic using the PPC's trip generation, generalized trip generation figures. And in addition, the highway-oriented businesses tend to have a high degree of what we call pass-by capture, which reduces their traffic impact on the roadway system, whereas residential is 100% new trips, people leaving their homes. As was stated earlier, we don't require, the change to CG on the city level would not require a countywide land use amendment. Public utilities are readily available to the site. The HB zoning limits the future development to a 0.4 floor area ratio, maximum heights limited to 30 feet, and as Ali stated, we would need to go through site plan approval, which would come back before this board and the Board of Commissioners at that time. Finally, in reading from your comp plan, policy 2.4.3 of the comp plan specifies that the CG land use is to designate existing commercial areas which may be either highway or commercial oriented and include uses of varying degree and intensity. Given the location directly on US 19, it clearly meets the locational characteristics for the city's CG land use designation and the countywide RNS retail and services designation. So we believe the proposed amendment is appropriate given the predominantly commercial surrounding uses, the frontage on US 19, a 6-lane major arterial through the city, and the large wetland buffer to the west. So with that concludes my presentation. Your staff's recommended approval. We request your approval. I'll turn it back to Amy for a summary. I'm here to answer questions too.
I have a question of legal, but maybe you want to conclude your summary, then I'll ask you.
Yes.
I have a question for legal.
Oh,
and
okay.
Then I'm going to, once I ask the question of legal, then you might be able to answer it.
Okay.
And I think, listening to Mr. Vesey, actually listening to all the permitted uses, there are like one use in particular that kind of concerns me in a residential area.
Right.
And that was the adult entertainment use. Are we permitted to request a restrictive covenant that runs with the land as far as a particular use, if we grant this moving forward?
So because this relates to the zoning, that is already a permitted use on that property.
I know that, but it's a permitted use.
Correct.
But regardless if the use is permitted, if there is a restrictive covenant that runs with the land, does that not trump what a permitted use would, regardless of if it's a permitted use? If there's a restrictive covenant, I don't think you can do it. And my question to legal is, could that be conditioned upon us approving the expansion of the land use to include a restrictive covenant? Or is it just blanket yes or no?
Right. Well, unfortunately, what you have right now is what's already a vested right in the property.
Not under the existing land, not under the.
It is under, because this is
Oh,
under
the
the zoning.
ROR?
Remember, this isn't the
Under this
land use that they're changing. The zoning is there already, so it already has that zoning.
Right.
And when I read like that list of 30 things, because there's a lot of that was very heavily commercial, A lot of that would not be allowed because it carries that ROR designation.
Well, this carries the ORR designation.
Right, but
So-
it's still HB. It's still
I
zoned this
understand that,
HB.
but I'm not talking about it, I'm not talking about restricting or affecting the
Right.
zoning. So what I'm asking is, let's say we go to the applicant, all right? And if the applicant is willing to provide a restrictive covenant with regard to that anybody's ability moving forward to restrict, I think a property owner has a right to provide or request a restrictive covenant on their property that moving forward, you can't do that. Am I correct or no?
Well, a property owner does, but we're not the property owner.
I understand that, but the applicant is the property owner.
Interject. I,
Yes. Ms. Huber, could you come up for a second? Do you intend to put an adult entertainment use on this property?
No, we do not.
Okay, so if I ask the owner, would they voluntarily place a restrictive covenant? I'm asking legal because I want to know that if we asked them to do it and they said not a problem and we did it, I want to make sure from our perspective that we can do that.
We can't make them do that, and if they do, it would have to be completely voluntary. I don't see that we can.
I know I know we can't force, but you know we're on the record here, and so if they're on the record that says this is what we'll do, I have faith in people abiding by their word. At least I still do. But I don't know. Am I going too far off in left field here?
Right.
I wanted to let Ally.
okay, I just want to.
So,
Yeah.
can you go ahead and read that?
Yes,
into the
I just wanted to
record?
interject. So while you're discussing, I wanted to look up any sort of location limitations for adult entertainment uses. So there's a whole section in the code that talks about that. The first one very specifically states that no adult business establishment may be located within 500 feet of any pre-existing residential land use property or any portion of a pre-existing mixed-use land use category utilized as residential, which would be the case
Answers
with
the
Brittany Park to
question.
the south.
Okay, yeah.
And just for further clarification, the distance requirements are measured from the property line. So this property could not have that use, regardless of it
I
being
should have
permitted.
just let you give me the
I'm
answer.
sorry, I just didn't have it in front of me at the time. Carry on.
They answered my question, thank you.
Okay, is there anything else? Just like to reserve a couple minutes in case we need rebuttal, if there's
Okay.
anything.
Yes, after public comments, you'll get that chance.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further board questions for the applicant first? Okay. Seeing none, we will call for public comment. Do we have members of the public wishing to speak on this item? Please approach the microphone and state your name and address.
My name is Scott Gross. I am an attorney with the firm of Greenberg and Nikoloff. We represent the Brittany Park townhomes to the immediate south of the proposed amended zoning area. We have obvious concerns with respect to, I think Mr. Vesey pointed out most of our concerns, honestly. Noise is a big one. The barrier system, whatever that happens to be, is at the top of our list of things that we want to be. I don't know that we can be involved in that process, but as much as we can be involved in the process, we want to be involved in the process. The adult entertainment thing seems like that's been sort of shot down at this point, but there are still concerns with the change in use to the extent that whatever new development is proposed to go on that property could be something that interferes not only with the noise and the use of my client's property, but also could affect the value of their property. If you've got some big monstrosity that goes up next to them, that's going to be an obvious eyesore that these folks are going to have to look at and live with for the rest of their life. When they moved in there, this was, obviously, it's as it is now, it's sort of an empty lot. We're not saying that that lot shouldn't be developed, just that we want to be involved, I think, in as much as we can be in the development process. So I don't want to take up a whole bunch of time, but I just wanted to raise those concerns, particularly the noise thing is going to be at the top of the list for my folks. So with that, I'll turn it back over for rebuttal, or if anyone has any questions.
Thank you.
for me.
Are there any other members of the public wishing to speak on this item? All right. Seeing none, does staff have any rebuttal comments?
No, I do not.
Does the applicant have any rebuttal comments?
I'm happy to reach out to Mr. Gross and to discuss their concerns, and I do believe that that's a more appropriate conversation once we get to the site plan, which we will have to address buffer and nuisance and the like. And my guess is that they probably will be much more favorable to the uses we're going to propose than the existing driving range with the lights and the balls and all of that. So I look forward to speaking with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that brings it back to the board for consideration. I need a motion and second so that we can have discussion.
I'll go ahead and make a motion to approve application 22-141, which is ordinance 2023-05 with regard to the future land use map amendment.
And I would second that.
All right, that brings us to board discussion then. Do board members have comments?
My main concern, whenever you have commercial, industrial type use that's immediately adjacent to residential use, there's factors of impact that may potentially be introduced that did not exist before and don't exist when it's residential, or commercial, abutting commercial. Usually it's light, dust, smoke, noise, as the gentleman brought up. So these factors going forward, because of the lack of buffering on the residential side, I think are the chief concern, certainly of the residents that live there, but me having known many residents who did abut commercial properties and having to deal with their woes over decades, it's something that's paramount importance. So the transparency by the applicant going forward, I think, is really the main concern about what gets put there, what the operations consist of, the placement of specific items of it, and things like that. That's my concern. Otherwise, the compatibility, obviously, it seems like the residential development there is kind of the abnormality, and you certainly don't want additional residential exiting on 19. So you put one thing to bed, but you open up the door for some other possibilities that would need to be addressed and mitigated in all likelihood going forward.
Other board comments?
No.
I have three.
Proceed.
Thank you. I'm deeply concerned, always concerned about these requests for changes, but I'm deeply concerned about changing the thoughtful process of those that came before us, who probably put good consideration into why they zoned it in a certain way to begin with, and if I'm using zoning wrong. So when we're taking someone else's thoughtful decision and we're revising it, that always causes concern, one. Two, the argument that there's industrial to the north and that therefore we should allow industrial or commercial to the south is a creep that I think is a false argument altogether. And in fact, I'd say the opposite should be done, is that Pasco can do what they want to do, but that doesn't mean we should let it in just because it happens to be there. 3, the applicant's transitory. Current owner and the current applicant is just a moment in time, and what we do now is going to be forever. And I don't think that that's a good argument to change this because these very polite, very well-spoken people come up and say, we're going to be good owners. We're going to be good developers. You know what? They may be, but it could be that they're only momentary and that someone else is going to come along and not be so nice and use this change as an opportunity to be, frankly, crummy neighbors to the people that already are there, whom are our citizens right here, right now. And I think that they hold more weight than anybody else does. We've already given them a place to live. We've said, hey, you get residential, and I'm going to add to it, is that the current zoning says it's supposed to be a mix. You know why they said it was a mix? Because they knew there was going to be residential there. And now we're going to take that away and say it's going to be commercial general and good luck. But it would have been zoned that way to begin with if everyone at that point thought it was a good idea. We've got wetland, we've got residential. Sure, it's on the highway, we can see that. I disagree and say it should remain exactly the way it should. It should remain as it is. End of comment. Thank you.
Any further board comments? Seeing no more discussion, can I have a roll call, please?
Mr. Rockline?
No.
Ms. Francis?
No.
Mr. Vesey?
No.
Mr. Kouskoudis?
Yes.
Mr. Seaman?
Yes. All right, that brings us to item number 6 on the agenda, discussion items. This is about proposed additional amendments to the annexation regulations within the code. Can we have the staff presentation, please?
Good evening, everyone. Renee Vincent, Planning and Zoning Director. So if you recall, we had a huge list of land development code amendments, a couple of comp plan amendments that we started, probably over a year ago almost, with the Planning and Zoning Board and the Board of Commissioners. We brought those through discussion items. We've taken them through public hearings. One of those, 2 of those items are still remain outstanding. One is the proposed changes to the annexation ordinances within our land development code, and then the other one that was kind of tabled, if you will, by the Board of Commissioners was on the coastal high hazard area land development code changes. So that eventually will be coming back here for discussion as well. But for tonight, if you recall, when the Planning and Zoning Board reviewed this proposed ordinance, we kind of tabled it essentially because several members of the Planning and Zoning Board wanted to have a chance to revisit the language, most specifically really with regard to broadening the Board of Commissioners' ability to deny a request for annexation if something is non-conforming in Pinellas, or would be non-conforming coming in. So so the ordinance that you have here was essentially the same ordinance that you reviewed previously, with one addition under section 208, and it would add under G, it would add a 6th review criteria when we're processing a request to annex a property into the city of Tarpon. And so that 6th condition that, based on the discussion that I heard that evening with the Planning and Zoning Board, and if I've missed the mark, we can go through this, and if you need to add or change or want to visit something else in the ordinance, that's great too. So that number's proposed additional condition or review condition is whether the property in question was reliant upon city utility service and developed in unincorporated Pinellas County in a manner that is non-conforming with adjacent city zoning and development patterns. So I want to step back a little bit because I'm not sure everybody was on the board when we talked about this the last time. So section 20-23 in our code of ordinances requires that if a property is going to be developed and it's in unincorporated county and it's adjacent to the city boundary, and they do require our utilities in order to develop the property, we have a requirement that the applicant must annex into the city of Tarpon Springs. And that has created some issues historically. And so the strike-through underline that you see here was previously presented to this board. And it's kind of sets up a bifurcation process to allow, we were running into issues with, there's no way to compel a property when they must annex, whose rules take effect as it goes through the process. So we essentially developed this language that says that you have two options if you're needs city utilities. You can either develop completely in unincorporated county under their rules, and when you're done and CO'd, you can annex in, or you request the annex in because you're required to, and then we review it and decide whether we're going to annex you. Or you can annex in vacant property, we put a zoning in place, you develop in the city of Tarpon Springs, and you meet all of our requirements. So we bifurcated the process, and that's what sections 1 and 2 under section 20-23 speaks to. And then we have the other sections of the Land Development Code that are the requirements of how we annex property and how we review it. And then that's where we've added the additional review criteria for consideration, where I've added the additional number 6 to kind of, where we have that situation where a property owner is elected, they're to develop in unincorporated Tarpon, they have to have our utilities. Then the board gives us the latitude. If it's something that is non-conforming now with our surrounding, and the way I wrote this was zoning and development patterns, then the board has the latitude to consider that and whether or not they annex the property in. So I've probably muddied this up a lot in discussion, so I'll stop and you guys can ask questions.
Just so I apologize, I'm a little slow today. But just so I understand it, one of the concerns that we had was, somebody could go through the county process and then we're forced to annex, whether or not it was something that was compatible with what we were looking for.
Right.
We had no choice. And what you're saying is under 6, it gives us a choice.
Yes, the board can take that into consideration as to whether or not we choose to annex that property, or we choose to let them stay in unincorporated county and we collect the surcharge on the water and sewer service. So that was the intent of that's what I added on that number 6 is an additional review criteria.
Annexation is not forced down our throat no matter what.
If it's incompatible and and doesn't comport with our with our, I don't want to say our zoning regulations, because you're getting this chicken and egg situation where until you actually annex it in, you don't know what the assigned zoning really is going to be. So I couch this as adjacent city zoning and development patterns as a way to.
We did an exercise of trying to develop a comprehensive land use plan for the city, and I think when we were going through that process, we also had discussion about how do we put our fingers in unincorporated county, unincorporated city limits that allow us to at least have that ability, because we may have a nice land use plan and right across the street, right outside the city's border, they do something completely way out of line what we were looking as far as a comprehensive plan. Obviously, there's nothing we can do if the county will allow them to do that. Wasn't there a discussion from the city to the county level about, and I don't know if we had this conversation about widening the land use so that the county would adopt the future, even though they may not be within the city limits, but the county would adopt or have something consistent in the county's land use plan that would take into consideration what we are trying to do in Tarpon. Didn't we have that discussion? I don't know if we-
We've talked about that, and I think where you're going is, we basically would have similar or nearly identical land use and zoning for an area that's within our planning area boundary. We know it's going to get annexed eventually. Can we go to the county and say, will you adopt this as your land use? That's a process. We can always, I mean, that's something that we can ask.
I
We
thought
can't
were doing-
compel.
I know we can't
Yeah.
compel, but I thought that was something we were asking them because we know that we're gonna be annexing certain properties in the future as they develop, okay? As we have to provide utilities for these properties. And so I thought and I know I'm going a little bit off tangent here, but I think it's important that when we have continuity in the city based on our land use, you know, to have something from the county come and screw up that continuity, I thought we talked about approaching the county to at least make what we perceive to be our annexation map. I think we have something that we anticipate, that there's continuity in the land use. Didn't I? I thought we were gonna.
We talked about a lot of things, a lot of ideas. I'll be honest with you, I don't know that I have absolute direction to do that, you know, from a policy perspective. The one thing I will say is that when we annex property, under our rules now, when we annex property, and I'll talking really about land use. So under our zoning, under our land use plan, the comprehensive plan, when we annex a property in, it has to come in at the same intensity or less, unless they're actually processing a land use map amendment that goes to the state and everything. So we already have that. Now, the zoning, where it really usually is the differences is the nuances of the zoning, you know, an R100 versus an R3 in the county. And you have different setbacks and lot sizes and things of that nature. Land use is actually pretty consistent because we do have the countywide plan and the history of how that's evolved over time. It's really where the zoning is where you start to diverge. And even that, we're supposed to be consistent, but, you know, a single-family residential to a single-family residential zoning district is generally going to be deemed a consistent annexation, but you still get nuances where, you know, changes in how accessory structures are and setbacks and fences and things like that, so.
I'm more curious about the density, you know, where we.
But density is really consistent, believe it or not. From municipality to unincorporated, generally speaking, because of, I'm gonna fire up the Wayback Machine for briefly here. So until 2015, that's when the last big changes were made to the countywide plan rules in Pinellas County. Prior to that, every municipality and unincorporated county had the exact same land use designations, categories. We all had residential low, residential medium, residential, we all had the exact same categories. And so it was very easy to see apples to apples comparison. That has somewhat changed now, but it's the history there of how we got where we are that we don't really see a lot of difference on, especially residential densities adjacent to, from municipality to unincorporated county. Now, the countywide plan rules have really shifted. They're just like a ceiling now, you know, of threshold. They're not very applicable other than, you know, we still have to comply with them. But you know, there's not a ton of difference at the edges. I'm sure they exist, but around here and looking at Tarpon and unincorporated county, they're not greatly different. But to your point, I have no, you know, if I get good policy direction, I have no problems going to Pinellas County and saying, hey, you know, they know we're going through our comp plan update. You know, how would y'all feel about some sort of an, you know, interlocal planning agreement for future annexations and land use designations? And, you know, we can, you know, obviously, I mean, I have to have clear policy direction to go do that, but
Think
that's
that's-
right, so
the-
that's
that-
on the table.
That's the discussion we had in the past, and it was kind of that was gonna probably be difficult to deal with Pinellas on that, but, I mean, at some point, Pinellas is gonna wanna talk about something else probably that'll come up or whatever, and maybe there's an opportunity to watch and introduce that, because I think that's the ultimate solution to the problem. If they would simply take a property that's getting ready to apply for a building permit to do certain construction that obviously has to annex to get utilities, and just make them come through us instead of them.
And that's the difficult one, that in terms of annexation process, that I may have to lean on the attorney for.
And, you know, to give you the example, okay, you know, not that, there's an application here for rezoning, but let's say they were not in the city of Tarpon Springs, and it's 45 acres. They go through the county, and their density is really, you know, just make up numbers, 4 to 5 units, 6 units per acre. And, you know, part of our land use plan may be 4 units per acre or 3 units per acre. Okay, and now we have no choice, you know, or almost have no choice, but, you know, because that may be outside of what our overall land use plan may have looked like we want less density and not everybody crammed in a shoebox construction. And that's why I don't know who gives you those, if that's direction that comes from this board or from the commission. But I'd really love to see, because it helps us when we look at annexation, that there's compatibility in our land use. And that's, to me, that's the thing that I think has been irritating me, at least.
Yeah.
All these annexations.
There is a process when you go through your comprehensive plan amendments and when the county goes through their comprehensive plan amendments, where you adopt these maps and adopt these types of categories, where neighboring and concurrent jurisdictions have the opportunity to provide comment, right? So when Pinellas County goes through their map changes and their map designations, relative to their comprehensive plan, it goes to the state, and then the state sends it to all the communities that would be affected by that, and you have the opportunity as a community to comment on that.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be better if there was like they said, interlocutory agreement in place that makes our land use, the county's land use in the areas that abut the city easier than have to go through, you know, an adversarial process with the county if we feel that there is something that's significantly different than what we were looking as far as our projected future.
One of the best examples of this, I think, that we saw, and it was a relatively simple thing, but it was a property that was having a single-family home built on it, and the home was almost built already, and it was built to Pinellas County's setback requirements, which in this particular instance were noticeably different, to the point that it stuck out much closer to the street than the other homes that were in Tarpon Springs, if I remember the situation correctly. And that is the kind of thing that some mechanism to catch before they're bringing it to us almost completely built, but when they first go to pull their building permit with the county, some way for the county to at least say, you need to meet Tarpon's requirements as well if you're going to annex into Tarpon.
And an interlocal, and I think that's where things kind of get difficult, because, and, you know, to caveat, I mean, to Mike's point, that had nothing to do with land use and the comprehensive plan. That was purely a zoning issue.
Right.
But
Mine's land use.
yours is exactly,
Mine's land use.
and that's something that, you know, we do work with the county, you know, on, you know, routinely, you know, if there's an adjacent property to the city boundary, and developers will density shop. Absolutely. And, we know that. And we coordinate with the county, and I've seen it happen recently on property for sale just outside of Tarpon Springs. And, they try to run it at the county, and Glenn and I talk, and so we know when those things are happening. And so, and we all try to push in the right direction.
Yeah, but Renee, if there was an interlocutory or some type of agreement with the county, they would be able to density shop.
True.
Okay.
But to the point of with annexation, interlocal agreements for annexation are really those are the requirements of how those have to be initiated, and the process is governed by state statute. And I know that the reason we don't have a lot of these is because they're really difficult. And one, the county likes to do these. If they're going to do these, they like to do them with all the municipalities, and so now you have something trying to be negotiated between every municipality. The land use piece is a little easier to address.
You could probably get a map of Tarpon Springs, get a pen, and draw a circle around the city of Tarpon Springs where you're going to see annexation, okay? And
Oh, sure. I mean,
yeah.
we have a defined annexation area.
Yeah.
It doesn't go south of Klosterman. You've got the one unique property that's the school. Otherwise, as soon as you get into the Palm Harbor Fire District, we can't annex property out of the Palm Harbor Fire District unless it gets approved by Pinellas County Board of County Commissioners. So that's a hard stop going south.
Yeah, and so
And then our self-described stop going to the other direction is George Street. So going out Keystone Road. So, so that's our area to the Pasco line.
So if you did communicate that with the county, so look, this is our projected annexation. This is our comprehensive land use. This is what we want the county to embrace.
Right.
Okay, instead of, because you may talk now with the county,
But the future, you're
but you don't
right.
know who's going to be there tomorrow.
Sure,
And-
absolutely.
And so somebody may have,
Sure.
a good rapport with the county, and next thing they get whatever density that they want, and we have it shoved down our throat.
We can certainly, and we probably would do this anyway. I hadn't really thought through this, but, we can put out a future land use map for the unincorporated area that is our annexation area, and we can ask the county through our review processes, as we're updating the comprehensive plan, to acknowledge it. And now what that acknowledgement may look like, whether they adopt it or not, that's a different story, but we would probably do that anyway as part of our update to the comp plan.
Because if there was some coordination in that regard,
Mm-hmm.
I think our discussion when we look at annexing properties would probably be a lot better than going through this.
But just recognize that the zoning intricacies are
Harder.
harder. Yeah.
Well, we're talking,
Yeah.
So there is a process in Chapter 171 that is the interlocal service boundary agreement process that talks about these areas and the services that are provided for municipalities, and creating a specific planning area and a process as it relates to establishing the land use under Chapter 163 and comprehensive plan amendments and annexations. And this is a very specific statute where it talks about how it's initiated by a resolution of the governing body, that it's sent to the county, and they have some very specific timelines in here, and specific information that needs to be included in the agreement that does address a lot of the areas that you're talking about in terms of making sure that there's compatibility, in terms of making sure that there's a smooth process that accounts for what the municipality is providing, and then what they're receiving on the other end after the annexation.
I suspect it would take the Board of Commissioners to give you that direction and not this board.
And I'm very happy to carry that message to them if that's what the board
I hope they're listening,
wishes.
because I saw a few commissioners running around here, so.
And should we entertain a motion to ask the BOC
Well, let's
to
finish this first.
That's,
do that?
Yeah, let's, I guess, I'm sorry. Do we have to finish this first and ask
Well,
for a
yeah, I was just
recommendation?
asking if we
Oh.
should. I wasn't trying to start the
Yeah, I made an
process.
attempt to address the discussion that I heard that I could fix in this particular ordinance. If you're okay with this verbiage, then we have to be re-advertised. It'll come back to you again because it needs to go through an advertising process. This was just for discussion tonight, so,
And let me read the title for you all as well. Ordinance number 2022-22, an ordinance of the City of Tarpon Springs, Florida, amending the City of Tarpon Springs Code of Ordinances, Chapter 20, Section 20-23, connections to public water, reclaimed water, and sewer systems, annexation required, and the comprehensive Zoning and Land Development Code, Appendix A, Article 12, Section 208.00 annexations, providing for severability, providing for inclusion in the Code of Ordinances of the City of Tarpon Springs, Florida, and providing for the effective date of this ordinance.
In the case of this, where it's a discussion item, are we looking for action on the item, or is just discussion is all?
if I am looking for direction, so I don't necessarily need it in a motion, it's because it's a discussion item, but I do want to get direction. If you're okay with this particular amendment, then I'll start processing it and bring it back to you for a formal public hearing process.
So I make a motion to say okay.
There's more discussion.
Just quickly, and I like the way it's composed very much. I think the proposition for the Board of Commissioners should be, we're looking for the most control, but we're also looking for the most cooperation with the adjoining jurisdiction, whatever that may be, so that together we go forward and make decisions that we don't regret decades down the road. But the way it's written certainly is something for them to consider, and then we come back and we can fine tune whatever else you think you need. But thank you very much.
Chair, were your concerns met?
Well,
We've been round and round about annexations, and I'm not certain, forgive me, I'm not certain that this is really getting as far as you'd like it to be.
this addresses the concerns that this is able to address, I think, at this point. The interlocal agreement, or whatever you want to call it, in my mind at least, is the permanent solution to this problem. This doesn't solve all of it as far as I'm concerned, but I think it probably goes as far as it's able to go at this point.
I think this is a Band-Aid for what we need and not the solution. I think if we ask the chair or if we can make a recommendation for Renee to carry, what legal said, and move forward. So I agree with you. It just, that's why it's frustrating to find, to get to a point where we don't have to have these frustrations at these meetings when it comes to annexation. So if the county would just look at continuity in our land use, then it makes, I think, it's easier for us to embrace an annexation. And this change is just a Band-Aid that allows us to say, no, you can't annex.
Okay.
Ms. Vincent, we have given you an almost impossible task. I know. I'm reading the gymnastics that you've been working through, and I appreciate you even tackling this. But I have a question.
Sure.
Under 20-23, paragraph 1, and then there's paragraph 2. I know you wrote them. You know these inside and out.
Well, it's been a while since I wrote them, though.
Okay. So paragraph 1 is self-evident. It's clear, it's concise. And then paragraph 2 more or less says, if you can't follow the rules, we're going to do this, 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 and this. How about, would the 2020-23 work if paragraph 2 was struck in its entirety? In other words, there's a rule, you either meet the rule or you don't meet the rule. And I'm going to ask you to take your time and don't be wishy-washy. So just the question is, would it work if paragraph 2 was struck? And would the city be able to move forward with annexations without that entire ambiguous exception?
That is the heart of the problem, actually, in that, all of paragraph 2 is new language. So, and the way this was written before, and I'll defer to our attorney. So before it 2 didn't exist, and it, you can kind of read. It says lands, not undeveloped. It just says lands abutting the city limits shall annex into the corporate limits of the city and be developed or improved in accordance with all existing requirements prior to water, sewer. And so that's the way it was written previously. And we still had all of these same issues because we can't compel Pinellas County to not take a building permit, start the building process. So all that still existed. So, and I was not the person that wrote this 2020-23 when that was adopted back in, I don't know, like the 2006-07 timeframe, I think. So we've lived with it, and we've always had these issues. So what paragraph 2 was trying to do was, that's the bifurcation process that says, if you start in the county, you stay there until you're done, and then we'll decide if we're going to annex you, because you have to apply, essentially, because you're using our services. Or you can, if you're not developed in your vacant land, you can join us in advance and take our service, and follow our rules. This was a specific bifurcation process to address something that we just don't have any direction on today, but is a problem that exists. So did that answer your question?
I think it did. In other words, what I'm just asked you to remove, or if it could work, is what we asked you to put in a year ago. At least I'm willing to admit. No, don't start gnashing.
No, my head hurts. Oh no, I'm just kidding.
Because we're here together.
I know.
We've been forced. Force is too strong a word. We have been told that we have to accept developments that frankly don't fit our best interest or the best needs, and you've done your best to put some words to maybe to slow that down or fix that.
Previously it was all inclusive. Didn't matter if it was developed, undeveloped, or whatever. It just says you must annex to get services. But as a matter of practicality, we can't compel the county to not start a build or issue permits, again, unless we had some interlocal agreement that would address that. That's why we set up, unless we can compel that with an interlocal agreement that says that Pinellas County won't issue a building permit in these areas until we've had a chance to weigh in on it in some form through an interlocal agreement. So that doesn't exist. So what we were trying to at least in the interim accomplish was setting up this bifurcated process where if it's vacant land, you have 2 choices, landowner. You can completely develop in the county, because I think the perception was that you start a build in the county and then you annex in because afterwards it might be more advantageous to be in the city to do certain things versus, so the perception that people were trying to game the system between the county and the city. Well, this at least stops that to a degree.
And can we then, like, multiply the increase in their water bill by, like, 10 or something?
So that's already set by a separate ordinance. That we have a surcharge for water and sewer service. If you are in unincorporated county, but you are using our services, then you pay a 25% surcharge on your water and sewer service bill forever.
That mounts up.
It does.
Not just that, not just that, and I think, just so because I went through the 1 and the 2, and the way I looked at it is the way you explained it is, if you're gonna apply through the county, you know, you gotta finish with the county, and then, based on the other criteria,
There's no guarantee you'll be annexed
yeah,
in.
there's no guarantee you're gonna be annexed.
Those are the words I want to hear.
And
That's what we set up, yes.
That's
Yeah.
where that paragraph
Yeah.
6 is important.
Yeah.
And it's just not the increase in water rates, it's policing as well.
Policing,
And
yeah.
that's a big thing.
Yeah.
And, because it's tough for the sheriff's department, if there's a call
Sure.
on the other side of the city limits, and our police force isn't gonna respond, it's gotta be county. So
Well,
there's-
for the record, we have first responders, so, I mean,
Everyone.
they won't just not respond,
I know,
but,
well,
yeah.
I
Yeah,
know that, but
mutual
we don't
aid.
patrol.
Mutual aid,
We
exactly.
don't
Agreement.
patrol.
They don't patrol, correct.
Okay, so, that's why it's important if a developer, you know, we have the ability to say no, if they say, we're, you know, that's why I like what you put in here, because it forces the person who's going through the county to stay with the county, and then we can decide whether or not, we will incorporate them at a later date.
Things like if they have code enforcement issues with the county.
Yep.
They can't run away from those and annex in, and things like that that are also good. So, I mean, I think it does what it can. It doesn't solve the problem as
Right.
far as I'm concerned.
You add the word land use instead of conforming with the adjacent city zoning and development patterns?
We can add zoning, land use, and development,
Yeah.
sure.
And then to defer to an independent third party, would council like maybe to structure the verbiage that might be the best way for the board if we're
To
in
ask the
agreement
BOC.
to give staff direction to move forward to the Board of Commissioners?
Oh.
Would that be appropriate?
Yes, if you wanted direction from them to move forward with exploring the opportunity for an interlocal service.
Is that what
boundary
you're looking for?
agreement with
Or
Pinellas
just,
County.
or just the consensus on this?
Well,
I'm looking for consensus on this.
Okay.
consensus on this is part A.
Okay,
Part B is moving forward.
Right.
Is trying to approach the commission about, trying to, all the things that the council said.
If I may, just really to parse, is that she's, Ms. Vincent, who has vast experience with the county, has made it, attempted to make it clear to us that it'd be very much a struggle with them for that interlocal. But her suggestion about floating the map that says, hey, y'all, take a look at this before that moves forward, maybe that's sufficient. So with that, I'd step back as A for sure, and then B perhaps second.
Trying to work something out with the county, so.
Compromise.
Yeah, so as far as this goes, do we want to just give it an informal nod, or do we want to have a roll call? Any preference?
I feel like I have good direction,
Yes.
Okay.
so.
And then as far as the other, what would our legal representatives suggest as far as the wording for a motion to ask the BOC or recommend the BOC ask staff to consider or look into options for interlocal arrangement of some sort?
So looking at the state statute on this topic, it says that it's initiated via a resolution. So without direction from the commission, you have to get that first. So just recommend that staff, or that the city commission give staff direction to explore an interlocal service boundary agreement pursuant to 171.203.
Good to me.
So that the land use on properties that will be annexed is consistent with what our land use plan currently is.
Correct.
Okay. Do I have a motion?
I'll make it.
Second?
I'll second.
Any further discussion? Can we have a roll call?
Mr. Rockline?
Yes.
Ms. Francis?
Yes.
Mr. Vesey?
Yes.
Mr. Kouskoudis? Mr. Seaman?
Yes. All right. That brings us to staff comments. Any other staff comments?
I do not have any. Renee?
I have none. Thank you for the direction tonight.
Number 8, board comments. Do we have any?
I'd like to take a moment to give a personal thank you to staff and council for the fine work that is being done right now. I feel like we're just hitting on all cylinders right now, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
I have just a real quick kind of general question. I don't know, a year and a half or so ago, we had kind of a workshop session that was pretty fruitful, I think, and a lot of good things are coming out of it now. We have a lot of new members that weren't involved in that process. I'm kind of wondering if the board would be interested in doing that again at some point in the not-too-distant future.
Definitely.
I'm interested.
Me too.
Fortunately, that involves staff after hours again, and I'm sorry that I'm interested. I know, I'm sorry.
Hey, that's part of our job.
But he's correct.
So maybe give us a couple months to all get our thoughts together on items we want to discuss at that
Sure.
session, but can we maybe look at setting some up in a couple months in the room upstairs like
Sure.
we did before?
Do it on an off meeting night, set us maybe a special meeting.
If that
It's
opportunity
a little
presents
easier,
itself.
yeah.
It doesn't seem like it's been doing that much lately, but
You could also make it a joint session with the city commission.
True.
So that if they're going to be discussing land use processes, procedures, sunshine, public records, all that stuff, you do it once.
if they were
I'll
able
run
to
through the
do
city
that, that
manager
would
with
be
that.
great.
Great idea.
You know, and this saves everyone the pain from the page of handwritten notes 1 through 4 that I've been carrying around for 3 meetings that I haven't brought up. I'm like, no, they don't want to hear it tonight. Which are those topics? So a little humor there.
Well, I've got a few of those, yeah. Okay, so we'll work on that. Any other board comments?
I just apologize again for being like
No problem.
time today.
All right, we stand adjourned.
Yeah, strike the sitting, Fleming.
Fleming?
Fleming, yeah.